Well, good morning, and thank you so much for being with me today. And you'll be pleased to know I've got a little question for you. Just a simple question. I'm sure you'll be able to give me a quick answer. And the question is this: if there is a God of love, why is there so much suffering in the world? Well, have you ever asked yourself that question? Have you ever been asked that question? Well, the good news is, in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to give you the perfect answer, the answer that will satisfy any questions on that subject. Well, you didn't really believe me, did you? I've got to tell you that if I had the brains of Einstein mixed with the wisdom of Solomon, I still couldn't give you a perfect answer, certainly not in 5 minutes. The truth is that you could fill a library with books that have been written on that subject. My literary hero, C.S. Lewis, wrote a book in 1940, I think, called The Problem of Pain. It is a big issue, isn't it? And some people would say, well, if you look at the suffering in the world today, either God is weak, he can't do anything about it, or God doesn't bother, he could do something about it, but he chooses not to. And yet, the very fact that we human beings ask the question, which is a moral question, leads to another question: where did we get our sense of morality from? From whom or from where? Why am I asking this question? Well, I had an email only this week from someone who's part of one of my churches saying, look, if some of my friends ask me that question, how do I answer it? That's a good question, isn't it? And the first thing I said was, well, if somebody asks you a really tough question, don't be afraid to say, I'm not really sure what the answer is. I'll go away and think about it, or look up some information, come back to you on that. Don't be afraid to admit when we don't know the full answer. Don't come up with some trite, simplistic answer. That won't help at all. The other reason that I'm grappling with this question this morning is that yesterday on my Facebook page came up an image that I'd put on Facebook 5 years ago. It was of me and two of my sisters, Jean and Mary. We were on our way to New Zealand. Why? Because we'd all been shocked with the news that our little brother Phil had been diagnosed with terminal cancer of the esophagus. He'd been given a very bad diagnosis, didn't have long to live, so the medical people said. So we decided we would go spend time with him and his family. And it was a tough time being with Phil in his anguish. People all over the world began to pray for him. He made a miraculous recovery in many ways, but 2 years later it came back and eventually Phil died. And you ask me, why did God allow that? And I have to tell you, I have no idea. Well, at least I don't know the answer. It's true to say that in the last couple of years of Phil's life, he had a tremendous and effective testimony to give and to share. People were touched by his life. Now, you might say, wouldn't it be great if we could travel back in time, go to that time when Jesus was walking around physically as a human being on planet Earth, ask him the question, why Jesus is suffering in this world? And I think that Jesus would not give us a straight answer. If you read the Gospels, very rarely when somebody asks him a question does he come up with the direct answer. Often he asks a question in return, or he gives a story or something to help people kind of work it through, that question. In Isaiah chapter 55, God says this: my thoughts are not like yours. My ways are different from yours. As high as the heavens are above the earth, so high are my ways and thoughts above yours. So there are some aspects of God's creation, God's world, God himself, that we cannot, with our human minds, answer. But perhaps part of the answer is that God created us with the gift of free will. He didn't create us as robots, which he could have done, so we had to obey his laws all the time. No, he gave us free will. And sometimes people misuse that free will. They make wrong choices. The drunk driver, the person who chooses to scam vulnerable people, the dictator who metes out injustice on his people, the warmonger. So many aspects of suffering today are caused by human beings making wrong, ungodly choices. choices, and we can't blame God for people's wrong choices. But you might say there are other causes of suffering, what we might call natural disasters. What about cancer? What about coronavirus? Well, we have to say it's not a new question, not a question we just ask in our scientific age. Listen to these words from the prophet Habakkuk. He said, "O Lord, how long must I call for help before you listen, before you save us from violence? How do you make me see such trouble? How can you stand to look on such wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are all around me. There is fighting and quarrelling." So Habakkuk's crying out, "God, why is all this going on? Why don't you help us? Why don't you answer?" He says the law is weak and useless. Justice is never done. Evil people get the better of the righteous, and so justice is perverted. So he's really struggling. Why? And another part of the answer perhaps is that this free will that God has given us to go his way or to choose our own way. When we choose to go our own way, disobey God's laws, we bring into the world came this thing the Bible calls sin, which we know is about when people choose not to do God's way. And that sin separated us from God. But Jesus came and walked planet Earth, and he died on a cross. He suffered on our behalf. There's a hymn that says, "We may not know, we cannot tell what pains he had to bear, but we believe it was for us he hung and suffered there." So we don't have a remote God who doesn't understand our human suffering. We have a God who came and lived and suffered himself. He knows exactly what it is to suffer as a human being. He also promises, "I will never leave you or forsake you." So even though we suffer, even though we face many questions that we cannot answer, God is with us in that suffering that we face. The last time Phil came to the UK, it was towards the end of his life, actually. He was clearly very unwell. He was not able to eat very much. His digestion was all shot. He was in pain. His hair had gone grey. But we had a prayer service at New Parks, one of my churches, and I asked Phil if he would just say a few words to us. And he agreed to do so. And I'll never forget what he said, really. And the heart of what he said was in 3 words: don't give up. Don't give up. Whatever you face, whatever suffering comes your way, whatever questions you have that you can't find an answer, just don't give up. Keep trusting in God. Now I've got a clock here at home, and it's one of those radio controlled clocks. So somehow radio waves come through the air, and that clock is totally accurate. Now, I'm not scientific. Some of you will understand how that works. I have no idea. I don't know how the clock works. I don't know how these radio waves come or anything like that. But I know that clock is accurate. I trust it. I don't understand, but I trust it. And that is how it is, I think, that we don't understand this question of suffering fully. We can say some things about it, but we don't fully understand. But we've got a choice. Do we trust God even though we can't work it out, or do we turn away from God? Now, I mentioned that prophecy of Habakkuk where he cries out to God, "God, why aren't you doing something? What's it all about?" At the end of that prophecy, he makes a great statement of faith. This is what he says: "Though the fig tree does not bud, and that there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Saviour." So even though everything goes wrong, I will still rejoice in God. I will put my trust in him. And of course, this life, this earthly life, is not all that there is. If it were so, then suffering would be, I think, a much bigger problem. But God promises that at the end of this earthly life, if our trust is in Jesus Christ, then we go through the curtain into a new life in the very presence of God, a life free from tears, sadness and suffering, and then maybe our questions will be answered. I've gone on quite a bit, I apologise for that, but let me finish with one little story. W.E. Stankster was a famous Methodist preacher in the first half of the last century. The story is told that he was away at a conference or somewhere, and he wanted to make a telephone call back home to his wife, and in those days it was called a trunk call, and they had to go through a number of different telephone operators. And as W.E. Sangster was on the end of the phone waiting to be connected with his wife, he began to say quietly to himself a verse of a hymn. And it's an old hymn written hundreds of years ago, and I've got the words here. He began to just say quietly to himself, "My knowledge of that life is small, the eye of faith is dim, but 'tis enough that Christ knows all, and I shall be with him." And so he was saying that quietly, and one of the telephone operators heard him saying that. He said, "Mr. Sangster, can you repeat those words?" And so he said it again. And the telephone operator said, "I just desperately needed to hear those words." So we don't know the answer fully. We can't answer that question fully to our friends. We can say some things. But at the end, God calls us to trust in him. He loves us. He will never forsake us. Wow. I've gone on quite too long. So God bless you. Have a great day.